I'm not sure there's anything more anatomically oriented than the aperture when we consider our photography and the lenses and cameras we work with to make our photographs. I mean, just face value, think of the aperture like an eye to the sensor, opening and closing to let scenes pass through, to let light pass through. There's something particularly poetic about that, and also something a bit mystical to it. So my goal today is to start to demystify aperture, to dig into its properties and how we can manipulate them in order to be more effective in various different environments, to consider this idea of a best aperture and probably, hint hint, to debunk whether that's actually a thing or not. And then finally, I want to chat about how we can ultimately speed up our shooting process dramatically when we feel like we need to. It's a technique I lean on quite often, especially in high intensity situations. So stick around until the end so that you can learn my main technique for that. Now, first, with the two main properties of aperture in mind, I want to create a point of emphasis that you should carry forward in all of your shooting, but especially when considering aperture. First, we can understand that aperture does really two major things. The first is that it creates a depth of field. So a smaller aperture such as f8, 11, f16 is going to create a wider depth of field, right? More of the frame from the point of focus forward and backward will be in focus. What it also does is add or take away light. So f16 will be significantly darker than f4, and f1.2 will be significantly brighter than f4. So if we understand that we're manipulating these two variables, potentially at the cost of light, then it becomes obvious that at some point or another, we're going to run out of light if the aperture in the scene or the aperture that suits the style or moment ultimately compromises our ability to bring in enough light. That's when we start to compensate with things like ISO. And I want to make a very clear point here. It is absolutely always more important to shoot for your style, your voice, your narrative, than for the cleanliness of the photo. So if f16 is what's most potent in this moment, if it's what's going to bring the frame together and ultimately tell that story better, then there's no question you should raise your ISO to whatever level it needs to get to. Now, we'll cover this a little bit in greater detail later on, but I just want to emphasize this, that your voice, your style, the narrative you're building, it's always going to be more important than any singular problem in the frame. So a very quick comment on the relationship between aperture and sharpness, because it's something that I think a lot of people get really caught up on. There is an optimal aperture for the sharpness possibility of your lens. Every lens has a point in its aperture range that is the absolute sharpest. To keep it as simple as possible, it's typically going to be right around f5.6. That'll be about as sharp as your lens will get. But some lenses are going to be a little different. Some might be extraordinarily sharp wide open at like f1.2, f2.8. This has to do to some extent with the lens manufacturer, what kind of glass they're using, how long they've grown their crystals or polished their lens elements. There's so many things that go into it. And in fact, two people can have the exact same lens, and the aperture value that is most sharp can vary between those two lenses because the manufacturing process itself has a degree of variability. It has a degree of error involved in it. So one lens might be sharpest at f5.6, whereas the next you might need to bump to f7.1 to reach that same level of sharpness. Now, I want to emphasize that you shouldn't overthink this. I think sharpness is probably the least important variable for you to consider. I think when people look at an image, it's the last thing they actually notice. So don't stress it. But if you really want to conduct the study yourself, if you've bought this shiny new lens and you want to know what the exact point is that is the best for its sharpness, go ahead and find a stagnant scene, something that's controllable, where the light isn't changing too much, the air quality isn't going to change too much, where you have about 5 minutes, and take the exact same frame at f1.4, f2, 2.8, 5.6, 7.1, 11, f16. Take that whole range, and then go ahead, bring them all into Lightroom, and analyze away. If you look at each frame side by side, you'll probably find that there's not a lot of difference. f1.4 might be just a little bit less sharp, And f16 to f22 will start to introduce a whole lot of diffraction and start to get a bit soft as well. But just about everything in between is going to be pretty dang sharp. If you can find that optimal point, good for you, you've got a good eye, and this exercise can help you build some trust with your lens. That's something you can use, but again, it's not something I consider. And as we'll dig into, going into why we choose different apertures in different moments, different scenes, or for different kinds of narratives, then this whole point kind of becomes moot to some extent because it's lower on the pecking order than the other considerations we're going to make. A very quick pause to say that if you're enjoying this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. And if you feel so inclined, all of this, aperture and any other settings I discussed, they all play a role in how we're ultimately building our narratives. And that's actually why I made my ebook, An Introduction to Photographic Storytelling. In that book, I go over just about every variable I've ever learned. All the techniques, all the settings, and all the different ways to manipulate those settings in order to become a potent storyteller. So if that sounds interesting, check it out in the link below. The best way to get it at a good price is to sign up for my newsletter. There's a fair bit of a discount hidden in there. One of the first major considerations you need to make when you're thinking about what aperture to choose, rather than sharpness, rather than light, is what scene is in front of you, and specifically, how are you going to capture it? So aperture will take on different levels of importance depending on how you're working with that scene. Consider for a moment a compressed scene like the one you're seeing here. Everything in this scene was captured using a telephoto lens. It's quite far away, and while the mountains might be spread out a fair bit, the nearest one is more than a mile away, and the furthest one might be 5 miles away. So in all honesty, if I'm at f2.8 or if I'm at f5.6, the whole frame is still going to be in focus. I don't need to stop down. Now, I might want to stop down to increase my sharpness, but I also might want to stay wide open to maintain more light if I'm at the beginning or the end of the day. All this is to say, I can get away with a lot more options in a scene like this because it's just not as important to consider depth of field. Now, consider this scene here, where we're actually looking at the foreground all the way to a mountain in the background. The only way for this image to work is if I use a very small aperture, in other words, a big f-stop. That's going to be something like f11, f16 even. I need as much of the frame to be in focus as possible. So what I'm doing is I'm planting my camera, looking down such that I can bring in the foreground and create that leading line towards the mountain. I'm stopping my aperture down as much as I can without introducing diffraction, and I'm taking that photo. That's going to introduce as much sharpness from the front of the frame to the back of the frame, making the image far more compelling than if there was a whole lot of blurred foreground. Now, I want to emphasize one thing. There is a way to take this image or to change the composition such that a blurred foreground becomes quite interesting. Consider this image here where the scene does bring in a lot from near to far, but I still use a blurred foreground because I think it helps add to the narrative effect. I'll get into this a little bit further in the next few minutes, but for now, consider the scene that you're in and the lens that you're using in that scene, and that's going to play a very major role in what aperture you actually choose. Next, there are some compositional techniques that are going to require a different kind of aperture. So in that last example, a leading line through the foreground, a low center of focus coming from right at your feet all the way to the mountain miles away, that's going to require a very tight aperture. But if we change our focus and our compositional technique to include a frame, such as the photo here, that frame would actually look, in my opinion, a little bit awkward if it was in focus, as well as the scene behind the frame. Now that's because we as humans, we wouldn't see all of that in focus. That's just not how depth of field in our natural perspective works. So a way to make this frame feel more organic and more compelling, to elicit the emotions and the narrative that really lives in it, the best way we can do that is to work with a wider aperture. It's going to be something like f2.8 in this case. Now, frames won't always be this way. Some of them will have various levels of detail where you might want to bring in more or less focus to that. Again, all of this is to say the compositional technique we choose is going to dictate what kind of aperture we have to actually work with. Next, and probably one of the harder to objectively define considerations when we're working with aperture, is the actual niche or genre of photography we're working in. So as an example, a landscape photo might be created with the simple purpose of capturing an absolutely beautiful or compelling scene in nature. The goal isn't necessarily trying to build as much of a narrative so much as it is trying to capture the elements that make that moment beautiful. So a broad plane of focus, a big aperture, that might be very, very important. But by contrast, something like adventure photography, where the emphasis might be on the story that a climber is experiencing, the emotions that are going on in a scene, the actual narrative within the environment rather than the environment itself. Suddenly, it can become a lot more important to use shallower depths of field. It feels more natural to perceive things in that way because our eye is always separating things. We do not create a broad plane of focus with our natural perspective. In fact, I've heard it's somewhere close to f2.7 or something like that. That just means that we are viewing the world with fairly shallow depths of field. So to create that natural perspective, to create an organic feeling narrative that's somewhat closer to how we would actually perceive it as a human being, we want to use a shallower depth of field and smaller apertures such as f1.2 or f2.8. When we're putting images in front of a viewer, the idea is to create this frame that they can view this scene through, right? So if we're thinking of it as a window, how relatable is the scene on the other side of the glass? To make it feel like it's right there, like you can reach out and touch it, you have to do things to make it feel like the natural human gaze. The point here, the broad idea, is that being a landscape photographer, being an adventure photographer, being a wedding photographer, all of these things will dramatically dictate what kind of aperture is most viable for being successful in that moment, for creating a compelling narrative. Now, my tip, the way that you can ultimately speed things up as much as possible, it boils down to configuring your camera in a very specific way. We're often taught that we're not professional photographers unless we're working in manual mode. And I do think it's really, really crucial to learn how to do manual photography. In fact, I actually shoot in manual mode most of the time, just because I find it more fun, to be quite honest. But when we eventually feel comfortable with our camera, when we know how to manipulate those variables, and when it becomes more instinctive, the emphasis can then become just reacting to what's happening in front of you. It might be most advantageous to focus on the style and the voice that you can elicit through your aperture and shove everything else out of the way. The way to do that is to put your camera into aperture priority mode. This means that all you are adjusting is the aperture, you're setting your ISO to auto, and you're setting your camera's shutter speed to auto. I like to add additional parameters that help to confine it to some extent. So the parameters I set are, for instance, a profile in something like this Fujifilm here, where the shutter speed can never go below 1/60th of a second. It's important to learn what parameters you consider viable in your camera. I can handhold my Nikon Z8 down to about 1/4 of a second and still get sharp photos. I can shoot all the way up to about 12,800 and have relatively clean images. You can configure your camera, and this works for Sony, it works for Fujifilm, it works for Nikon, it works for Canon. Every camera has this possibility. You can absolutely set this up to let the camera do a lot of the work for you, and you don't have to feel this guilt like you're not professionally photographing a scene if you're not working manually. The absolute truth is that most of the professionals out there are just using what's most effective for them to get the images they need. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Aperture is one of those things that we maybe don't think enough about. I believe it's really the most core element of the exposure triangle to our creative vision, and I hope this helped to demystify it to some extent. If it did, let me know. If it didn't, also let me know. And other than that, have a good one. I will see you guys in the next one. Cheers.